How about you? So good to be here. How about you give? Okay, we're done. Thank you so much. Awesome. How about you give a couple of people a high five and take a seat? It's great to be with you. Thanks, guys. Who likes the drum, like the vest and the hair down, classic rock drummer look? I mean, some of us, that's not an option. It looks very cool. Hey, it's great to be here, and it's so good, isn't it? The theme of this conference about like a river, and that whole picture from the book of Ezekiel that there is a river. They're not that there might be, or there in the future could be, but there is a river, and some of you have had a touch of that river last night and in the last few days. Is that right? How many people put your hand up if you had a touch of the river? And it's like, it's so amazing in the book of Ezekiel when the angel then takes him on and says, this is not just about a moment, but look what happens. And the angel shows him wherever this river goes, life springs up and places are transformed. And it's like, oh my goodness, we get to be part of something that we experience, we encounter, but it's going to change our world. Our cities are going to change. Our nations are going to change. Our families are going to change because there is a river. Amen. But it's like in the middle of this vision, there's the key point. It's like, here's the challenge. You got to get in the river. And it's like you can put your foot in and get kind of ankle deep, and that's nice. Or you can go knee deep or waist deep, or you can launch into the river. And so the challenge is not just to have a moment, but the key challenge is this: how do I commit? How do I dive in? How do I kind of let go and plunge into the river of God? And so I want to talk a bit about that. Now, I got to kind of apologize to the Brits in our midst. So, because I need to tell a story, and I would never say this, but one of your own, some of you might have seen a little comedy skit by the comedian Michael McIntyre. Is that right? Now, we would never say this, but he says he loves Britain, he loves Brits, but as a Brit, he says, we can be a bit embarrassing overseas on holiday. Is that right? He's like the Germans and Italians, they just, even when they got a big belly and not wearing nearly enough clothes, they just look cool, right? Is that right? And they sound cool. Just need slightly bigger swimwear, but he's like, as a Brit, he's like, man, I love Britain, but overseas, it's just like they're lathered in sunscreen, but there's blotches that they miss that are bright red because they're sunburned, and he's like, it's just embarrassing, really. And then he said, and when sunbathe, it's like they've been shot, and they're kind of spread-eagled on the ground, lathered but blotchy, but then he talks about what happens when they're going to go for a swim. Like, this is the thing about when you're committing to going into the water, probably a swimming pool rather than a river, but the principle's the same. And just for the sake of using translation, I'll have to explain it to him, because Michael McIntyre says this: what a palaver. So for those trying to translate, that means an unnecessarily elaborate or complex procedure. So this for the rather Europeans. Let me explain on behalf of the Brits who we love in the place, what that palaver looks like. So the person who's spread-eagled and blotchy and sunburned suddenly stands up. Sorry, I can't do accents, but stands up and says, I'm going in. Is that right? I'm going in. To which everyone else then says, he's going in. He's going in. And so, but then the process that then, it's probably a swimming pool, walks to the edge and tips his toes in, and what happens? It's freezing. Is that right? To which he says there's a universal response from those who are already on the other side of the palaver and are in, which is to say, it's all right once you're in. Is that right? Totally irrelevant piece of advice, but that's the thing that you do. And so then it's like toes in, it's freezing. Up to your knees, it's freezing. And it's a bit more complicated in New Zealand because it's probably not a swimming pool or a river, it's probably the ocean. And like when you're young, it would be just run in and dive in. But now, my age, it's the similar thing. Like, it's freezing. And you wait for your feet to go numb. And then up to your knees, that's freezing. Wait for that to go numb. But it's more complicated because in front of you, you see this wave coming. So it's like, right? And then next one. But you know, at some point, you're going to have to commit. You're like, I'm going to get a slap of freezing water, so I just got to dive in. And Michael McIntyre talks about, finally, the same happens for our quintessential British person, and he finally launches in, and when he emerges out the other side, he says the standard phrase, which is, it's all right once you're in. Is that right? So, yeah, that's a bit of education for the Germans and Italians about the spectacle that you see in your nations of Brits on holiday. But that's the challenge, is like, if this idea of Christian faith and the movement of God as a river, here's the central issue. Like, how do I commit? How do I get in? How do I dive into this thing? Because I don't know about you, I don't just want to have had a touch of the river last night and then I go back to normal. Like, I'm captivated that there is a river and it's going to transform our world. And so the only issue is, how do I launch into this thing? How do I take off the restraint? How do I fully engage with the river of God? How do you understand that? And there's lots of different biblical language for that. We talk about you need to open your heart to God. We talk about you need to serve something bigger than yourself. Maybe we talk about we need to submit to Him as Lord. We're singing a song, we need to surrender all to Him. But Paul has some language for this moment, this process that I want to talk about today. And it's found in a famous passage, just a couple of verses. We're just going to look at 2 verses today in some detail. Romans chapter 12. But if you understand this as Paul kind of encapsulating in one concept, here's how you engage with the river. And I pray that this morning you're ready to engage with the river. And we're going to finish with an opportunity for you to respond with this understanding. Yeah, I want to launch in. I don't want to dabble. I don't want to paddle. I want to commit to the river. And so let me read this. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies, here it comes, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Goes on to say, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. I've been thinking about this over the last few months. At the end of this year, I've been in ministry 40 years. It's basically my whole adult life. I've been a Christian about 50 years, and I've been thinking, I don't know, it hasn't been that good to probably deserve a clap, but it's because I've been thinking, like, how do I think about that? And it would be great to go, God, look what I've done for you. And it would be great to kind of, but I just feel like what I can do is stand before God and say, God, I gave my life to you. My life has been a sacrifice. I offered it to you. Hasn't always been flash, hasn't always delivered what I wanted, but God, I gave it to you. And I feel like that's been a helpful way for me to think about it. But sacrifice can be a bit of an odd concept for us. It's a bit foreign. You know, for us, church and religion is about this. You go to a building, there's some music, we sing some songs, we listen to a talk, we have a cup of tea, and then we go home. So it's kind of it. In the ancient world, the world of the Bible, it's really different. Religion was you build these massive stone or marble temples. And at the front of it, you build a big altar. And religion, you brought animals and you sacrificed them. That was religion. And it's like, man, we need to understand that world. Just a few weeks ago, Christine and I, my wife, were in Sicily with Pastor Francesco and Pastor Tania, and we visited a place called the Valley of the Temples. We've got a photo here somewhere. Hopefully coming. That's my wife delicately positioned in front of a obscure statue there. Right after us, there was this, again, elderly English lady just kind of leaning on this. Anyway, but whatever. But so we don't get distracted, if you can put up the next photo. And it's like, welcome to the world of religion in the Old Testament and the New Testament. You build temples, you build an altar, and you come and offer sacrifices. And what's fascinating is the early Christians really confused this world. Roman people like, we don't get you. In fact, the early Christians were called atheists. Do you know that? Because it's like, you don't do this whole God thing, do you? You don't have temples. You don't have altars. You don't present animals as sacrifices. And that's where to understand the profound thought of the Apostle Paul. He's like, no, do you know what? We see ourselves as a community as like a spiritual temple. But here's the kind of drop the mic bombshell moment. We don't bring offerings or sacrifice. You know what? We see our lives as a living sacrifice to our God. It's like, oh my goodness, that's incredible. And Paul's encouragement is this: I urge you, I encourage you, see your whole life as a sacrifice to God. And can I say that's the key to stepping into the river? That's the key to not just paddling and being in control. God, my whole life is a sacrifice, an offering to you. Now, you may have two responses to that. On the one hand, there'll be people like, whoa, time out. That's not what the preacher told me. It was like, put your hand up and Jesus is going to be your best friend and he's going to be nice to you. No one told me that. Sacrifice. And I pray in the next few minutes that I convince you that this is the most beautiful, attractive, compelling, lovely thought that you would like, oh my goodness, do you mean I get to do that? That's amazing. But on the other side, there's equally kind of weird ideas that Christianity is all about suffering and serving and dying. There's these kind of weird ideas like, if you, apologies to anyone from Africa, but it's like, if you in your deepest heart think, I would never want to live in Africa, well, make sure you never verbalize that, because then God will definitely call you to go to Africa, right? So that's just weird, screwed up thinking. Or, if you love playing the piano, God will definitely ask you to lay that down, because it's all about sacrifice and suffering and dying to self. And it's like, that is also not what sacrifice means. The very context after Romans 12, verse 1 to 2 is about spiritual gifts, where Paul says this kind of language in verse 6. If your gift is prophesying, prophesy. If it's serving, serve. He's not like, crucify it, lay it down, sacrifice it. No, we steward our gifts. We're not called to sacrifice our identity and our gifts and our passion and our deepest heart's desire. We're called to steward that. But what we are called to do is to sacrifice our independence and our pride and our stubbornness and our rebellion, and just go, God, everything that I am is an offering to you. And then I'll ask how you've wired me that I get to steward that. Even, Jesus said, Luke chapter 9, you need to deny yourself and take up your cross. And it's like, being a Christian is just taking up my cross daily. I've got to put up with that annoying mother-in-law or that annoying little sister or something. And it's like, no, Paul's clear, Galatians. No, you crucify the flesh. You crucify your brokenness, your independence. You're not called to die to the person that God made you to be. You're called to steward that. And it's like, man, so what is sacrifice? Even, to be fair and balanced, at times God does call people to sacrifice. Genesis 22 with Abraham, sacrifice your son. But it's clear God tests at certain times, because he's like, I want to know, do you worship me or do you worship your dream? But it's never the long game. If you read the story, God restores the dream of Abraham. God tests things. But we're like, man, how do I think of this thing called sacrifice? And so this is how I think that we should think about it. This is the key thing. You ready? It's a response of love. It's a response to love, and it's a response of love. That in response to what God has given me, it's like, what else could I do? But God, I just give everything back to you. And then in a strange, paradoxical way, you kind of give it all back to me again. And it's like I'm caught up in this circle of love. And you see this in the way that Paul talks about it. And some of you might have heard of talking about criticism sandwiches. If you're going to put a bit of criticism and you put some compliment at the top and the bottom, so the bread, that metaphor. So I want to say Paul does a sacrifice sandwich. In the middle he's talking about sacrifice, but at the start and the end he kind of sets the frame of that. And you might want to think he gives the foundation and the fruit, or he gives the reason and the result. Is that right? So I want to help you understand, what does it mean to get in the river? Like, I just need I need to give my life as a living sacrifice to God. You ready for that? Let's have a look. So the passage starts, verse 1. Therefore, which builds on what's before, in view of God's mercies. I think the translation says mercy, in Greek it's plural. And so the concept is he spent 11 chapters talking about what? How much God loves you. God's sacrifice for you. And therefore, in response to that, I urge you to respond back to that in a responsive self-giving. God has demonstrated his love to you through sacrifice. There's an invitation to respond to that. It's kind of like a wedding service, and you see this in a phrase. It says there, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. I don't know if any of the older people that evokes any associations, but in the traditional Church of England prayer book wedding service, there's a very strange moment in a wedding service. Well, it strikes us as odd language. It's the moment of the exchange of rings. And this is what the groom says to his bride. This is traditional language. With this ring I thee wed. With my body I thee worship. With all my worldly goods I thee endow. Most of us say it's quite shocking. With my body I thee worship. I thought worship was just for God. It's an old English concept of the word. It's like, in recognition of the worth of who you are, I give everything that I am. I give my very body. I give all that I am to you. And then in response, the bride says, and in response to that, I give myself to you. And I want to suggest to you that's at the heart of what Paul's thinking. There's a New Testament scholar, John Barclay, who's written a lot the last few years about the concept of grace and gift. We have an often modern Western idea, gift is unconditional. So we have this idea, in the Old Testament there's unconditional arrangements and there's conditional ones. And he's like, no, it's actually more complicated than that. It's not, it's like there's this concept that a gift, it's not conditional on what you've done, but it is an invitation into relationship. It is an invitation into, big word, reciprocity. It is an invitation to come back. And even today we would recognize that. It's like, if you're the one who's always inviting your friend out for lunch and always paying, at some point you're going to go, this is not a relationship, right? Real relationship starts unconditional giving, but is looking for some reciprocal response. That's how relationships work. And I actually found this quote from an old book that I'm going to mention a bit later. It's written in the 1600s by a Puritan, so it's very old-fashioned, wordy language. But see if you can follow this. This is what he says. He's talking about the two hands of faith. Presumptuous faith is lame of one hand. It hath a hand to receive pardon and heaven from God, but no hand to give up itself to God. True faith hath the use of both her hands. Quotes from Song of Solomon. My beloved is mine, there the soul takes Christ, and I am his. There she surrenders herself to the use and service of Christ. That's healthy faith. That's healthy relationship. And so Paul, it's not a command, it's a plea. I urge you. It's like Jesus has given himself completely to you. I urge you, plead with you, encourage you to respond back with a responsive act of sacrificial love and giving. So that's like the foundation of sacrifice. It's not me sacrificing. No, he sacrificed in love, and he invites me to kind of come into this relationship where I give myself fully back to him as well. But then I said it's a sandwich, so there's also the other side, the fruit of it or the result of it. And you see this end of verse 1, it says, this is your spiritual worship which is pleasing to God. I don't know if we've got verse 2 up there as well. If you look down at the end, in Greek it's the same word. Here's the surprise. It's pleasing to God when in response to his love you give everything to him. But here's the bombshell. it's going to end up pleasing to you. It is going to end up pleasing to you. And he goes on to say, verse 2, that you'll be able to test and approve. It's like, God, I don't understand what you're doing, but I feel like you're calling me to lay my life down. And one of the advantages of being older, a hand on heart, I can tell you, it will work. If you put it to the test, it will work. And you will give it the tick of approval. It worked. Thanks for the one person who was about to clap and thought that was good. I remember when I was probably around 19, which is a very long time ago. When I was 16, first time ever I heard God speak to me. I was at school. I hated school. I thought, I'm going to leave school. And then sitting in a church service, first time I ever felt God speak to me, he just said, you're staying at school, you're going back next year, and then you're going to university. I was like, okay, but then the next 3 years were just passive aggressive, like, I'm only here because you told me to, God, I hate this. But I remember as a 19-year-old at university, another city, like, I hate this, I don't like being here, I'm only here because you told me to. And I felt God say this, remember this is 19-year-old, said this, if you could see what you would be doing at 30, you would like it. And I have to work it out, but basically at 30 is married, 2 kids, we were living in the Philippines, working amongst the urban poor, I'd studied theology, and it's like, oh my goodness. When you give it to God, He gives you something back that is going to be pleasing to you. And I feel like the Apostle Paul, I want to persuade you of the truth of this. I want to urge you to accept this truth. You know, and let alone now, kind of another 30 years on to go, man, God, you've satisfied every desire of my heart. I can't believe what I get to do because I gave it all to you. And, and you see this in the end of the passage, 3 words that Paul says this at the end of verse 2. You'll discover this about it this is the sacrifice sandwich. So the first part was in response. The second part, what happens when I do this? This is what you're going to discover. This is what you test, and you're going to say, yep, it works. You're going to discover God's will is really good. That's Genesis 1 language. Man, God, you've been so good to me. You're going to discover that it's really pleasing. It satisfies God created you. He knows what you're created to do. Of course, His will eventually is going to align. He's not that dumb that He's going to create you one way and then call you somewhere else. That's that really screwed up Christian thinking about sacrifice. No, it's going to be pleasing when you surrender to Him. But then He makes the most extraordinary claim. It's not only good, it's not only pleasing. If you're willing to lay your life on the altar for Him, if you're willing to go with that, do you know what you're going to discover? That it's not only good, it's not only pleasing. This is the Apostle Paul in the Bible that we heard last night. We believe this. So this is a testament of faith. You are going to discover it is perfect for you. Like, that is pretty big language. Oh my God, I thought I was laying it all down. I thought I was sacrificing, and instead you gave me what was perfectly designed for me. In Greek, the word perfect has to do with achieving purpose, reaching goals, becoming the mature. It's like I became all that I was created to be. You know, and I've said this before, my wife and I often we've been around the UK quite a bit in Europe. We often walk around like we can't believe that we've ended up here. I can't believe that I get to be part of this. But it all started with a 15-year-old that stood at the front of a thing like this and just said, God, I just give it all to you. And a 20-year-old that had all my own plans and dreams, and God reminded me of what I'd said when I was 15 and said, yeah, Lord, I give it all to you. And I can, as an older guy, 40 years later, can I say, it's been good, it's been pleasing, it's been perfect. Would you trust God with that? So we find ourselves in this paradox that Jesus talked about. Matthew 10. I'll see if we've got the right reference or not. Yes, we have. Well done. Matthew, whoever finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Matthew 16, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will find it. Here's this crazy, I gave it all away. And in the mystery of God, I got it all back. I laid it all down. And I got back everything that I ever dreamed that I would want. I can see some of you are being persuaded. That's awesome. And then I love in the middle of the verses, starting, this is not just a transaction, this is a transformation. Don't be conformed, but be transformed. That this is not just a one-off, but I enter in this process when I'm actually becoming the person that could reach my destiny. You know, sorry, this is a bit mean, so just strengthen your heart a bit if you're easily offended. But we often joke around people like, oh God, is she the one or not? And God's like, oh my God, who am I going to afflict you on? You're going to be a tough ride as a husband, whatever, Oh God, I got these 2 job options. Which one would I do? And like, oh, you're going to be a nightmare as an employee wherever I send you. Like, I don't know. But as opposed to like, no, hey, man, God's like, wow, you're going to be a blessing as a husband, whoever you marry. You're going to be a great employee wherever you go. This idea, God's more concerned with how we marry than who we marry, with where we work, with how we work than where we work. And it's like, this thing is not just hi, you can clap that. That this laying down is like, man, the frustration in my life is not surrendering to God. This frustration in my life is the brokenness in my life that means I keep messing up and not achieving the thing that I want to achieve. When I give it to God, He invites me into this process of transformation. I love being part of Equippers College and the sense that people often lay down a year, give a year to God. And I really loved, we had recently had graduation in the UK and talking to John Everett, one of the trustees of the Equippers Surrey Church, a few days later, and he made this statement that I really loved. He said he was looking at all the graduates on stage and he just said this thing, something happened to that lot. And it's like, yeah, when you give yourself to God, He transforms you and something beautiful happens. And I don't want to take the advantage of this moment to manipulate people, but I have a sense, in the college, there's a great college in New Zealand, there's training in mines, in Rome, in Budapest, Slovakia. We've started this college here, but I have a sense like God is going to interrupt some people's plans. Like, you made this plan, would you trust me to just lay it down? And I can hand on heart promise, if you'll give God time, if you'll give Him space, He's going to transform your life in beautiful ways, and you'll never regret it. So come to the college experience this afternoon, okay? Advertising breaks over. In the middle of these verses, there's an interesting phrase that's difficult to translate. It says, this is your true and proper worship. The New King James says, this is your reasonable service. This is what it's basically trying to say. Guys, this thought that in response to God's sacrifice and love and understanding that He's so committed to where you're going to go, guys, the most logical, reasonable, spiritual thing to do is just to give yourself completely to God, to stop paddling on the edge and dipping your toes, just to launch into this thing, just to go, my whole life is a sacrifice for you. My whole life is an offering for you. I just want to speak to 2 groups as we move towards, and I'm going to invite some people to respond. Let me speak to younger people, whether that's younger in age and younger in faith. I would do what Paul did. I urge you, I implore you, I beg you to settle this now, to get this foundation right. We wrestle with what am I going to do for a job? Who am I going to marry? Where am I going to go? It's like all of that is the second questions. The first question, God, my whole life is an offering to you. And I really said all this. Christine and I, my wife, we've been married 35 years. There's been some hard times as family, hard times as couple. But one of the things I love is this was settled for us both as teenagers. No, we do what God says. Our lives are an offering to God. I mentioned this last year when Pastor Sam mentioned starting a college in UK. I was like, oh, we'll go. I forgot to ask my wife. That's not good. Don't do that. That's not marriage advice. And I told this story last year, so many of you heard this, but I went home and said, Chris, dear, Pastor Sam's going to start a college in the UK. And she's like, oh, that's nice. And I was like, I said we'd go. And I've heard this, it's a two-word response, of course. Because that was settled when we were 15 or 16. And everything is on a trajectory that, of course. You know, at college, we do a lot about people understanding their strengths and their gifts and their personalities. People always love it because it's all about them. And then they are like, oh, man, this was so... But we do it in the second half of the year, and people are like, that was so cool. We should do that right at the start of the year. Like, no, we deliberately do it in the second half of the year. Because the first half of the year is like, you need a vision of the big story of what God's doing. You need to understand a vision for his kingdom and his church. You need a passion for God's river flowing into the community. And once you get that, and once you commit to that, then as the second question you ask, okay, God, how have you wired me to fit into that story? What am I stewarding to engage with that? And so again, I want to say, like, man, it's good to settle this. Get the vision right first, then ask all those questions. God, what's next? Go to this university in relation? Yeah, those are all second questions. But the foundation, my whole life is a living and loving sacrifice to God. Many of us who are older have had those moments. I can tell you the moment as a 15-year-old standing at a conference like this, as a 20-year-old feeling that. Pastor Bruce has a story as a young dairy farmer kneeling on a cow track and just surrender to God. Can I plead the language of Paul? Can I plead with you? Can I urge you? Can I implore you today? Settle this issue. My life is a living sacrifice to God. But I also want to talk to people further down the track. And particularly, maybe you can get Wayne up, that'd be good. And particularly people who feel like they're lost the way. Because it's a bit of a preacher's cliche, but the thing about a living sacrifice is you can climb off or you can slide off. And to be honest, there's moments that I've experienced when it's like, God, I feel like I've lost my way. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And the more scary question, God, I don't know if you want me to do this anymore because I don't know where you are anymore. And I don't know what to do about that. And one of those moments, like I literally don't know what to do. I came across a sermon by David Wilkinson, who wrote The Cross and the Switchblade and other things. And it was a sermon, the title was called Losing the Anointing. And he talked about a time in his life when he felt like, I've lost God. God's not there anymore. And he's like, I'm done. And he went through his diary, cancelled all his appointments, but he had one appointment he couldn't cancel. And on the way to that, the prophetic guy, revivalist Leonard Ravenhill, came and brought him this book and gave it to him. Massive 1600, written in the 1600s, 1,000-page book. He's like, I don't want to read that. Throw it down. Holy Spirit just said to him, pick it up and read it. And I was like, man, I don't know what to do, but if it was Leonard Ravenhill's spirit-led advice for David Wilkinson, I'll do the same. So I got this book, and it's called The Christian in Complete Armor. It's 1,000 pages, incredibly wordy. Just skim through and find the titles and the key sentences. But it's like, what do I do? And it's like, hey, Ephesians 6 says, be strong. Here's what it takes to be strong. Here's what you need to put in place. I was like, God, are you asking me to rebuild this? Here's what it means to stand. Put these things in place. Here's what it means to wear the belt of truth again, to live with sincerity of heart. Start putting these things in place. Here's what it means to live with a righteous heart. Here's what it means to protect your heart. And I realized it was a call to this. Just rebuild the altar and climb back on. What do you do when you've lost your way? What do you do when you wonder if it's all over? You rebuild the altar and you climb back on. You know, there's one thing about a 15-year-old who goes, God, I just give it all to you. And that's so precious. And we're going to create that moment. There's something else about a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old who goes, God, it hasn't kind of worked how I thought. But God, I choose to rebuild the altar and to climb back on and say, God, my life is a living sacrifice for you. And why is that the way ahead? Well, just 7 verses before Romans 12, 1 and 2 is Romans 11:29. For God's gift and his call are irrevocable. He hasn't changed his mind. Roles change, decisions have consequences, but he is still committed to you in loving sacrifice. And when you've lost your way, rebuild the altar and climb back on. It's what Elijah did. He repaired the altar of the Lord. I think there's a moment, in a few moments, for some people to rebuild the altar and climb back on. It's costly and it's beautiful for God. Just want to quickly show this from 2 incidents in the life of David. One of them's really familiar, but I want to highlight something a bit further on. 2 Samuel 11, David lost his way. He's supposed to be going off to war. He didn't do what he was supposed to do. He sent Joab out. You know the story. He lusted after a woman. He committed adultery. She got pregnant. He lied. He deceived. He murdered. We kind of know that, but there's actually another really sad thing, that Bathsheba got pregnant. This baby boy was born. The baby got really sick. David's fasting and praying, and the baby dies. You can't imagine another situation in which you would feel more, I lost my way. Like, what a mess. And then it says this. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and he made love to her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. And the Lord loved Solomon because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah, which means loved by God. The same prophet who came and said to David, David, you've messed up, came to David and said, David, God loves this little boy. Your future's not over. I'm still at work in your life. I'm still doing beautiful things in your life. You know, I love the next part. This reminds me, I guess, of that passage in Ephesians 3 where Paul talks about, could you grasp how wide and long, how high and deep is the love of God? Your decisions take you to places, but here's what you need to know. They never take you outside the love of God, because he stood at the altar and said, I've given myself to you. And I still love you, and I'm still going to do beautiful things in your life. And I love, verse 26, it just says his mate Joab, who's the guy who had David had failed earlier on. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites, captured the royal city. This said, Joab sent messages to David saying this, I fought against this place, I've taken its water. David, muster the troops, come, besiege the city, otherwise I will take the city and it will be named after me. He's like, David, you're my best friend. Come on, David, it's time to get back on the horse. Come on, David, it's time to pick up the call again. Come on, David, it's time to pick up those dreams. However you lost your way, it ain't over. It's time to get back in the game. Time to come and rebuild the altar and just get back on the altar. And keep going after the call on your life. Come on, it's time to get back. I wish I could boom that out to somebody. It's time to get back on the altar. It's not over. It ain't all over. I think maybe David would have learned his lesson, but there's a second passage later on in his life. He messes up again. Maybe that's the suggestion. We should learn how to do this process well, because you're going to keep sliding off this thing. I've got to learn how to keep getting back on the altar. So David lost his way again. He took a census of fighting men. It's not quite clear why that was so bad, but everyone knew, no, David, that's the wrong thing to do, but he did it anyway. It's probably around pride and independence. So he did the census. As soon as he did it, he knew it was wrong. It unleashed a plague on the nation. Again, how screwed up could you be as a leader? I was supposed to be serving this people, and I've destroyed it. And then a prophet comes to him. Verse 18, 2 Samuel 24. Gad went to David and he said, what's his instruction? What do you do when you've totally messed up? This is what the prophet said. Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of this guy. What do you do when you've just so messed up, lost your way, not sure? Just get to the point of the problem and build an altar again. And say, God, I'm back. You know, and if you know the story, he goes, finds this guy. God, what do you want? He's like, I want this land to build an altar. The guy's like, you can have it. A famous response, verse 24. The king replied to this guy, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. He's like, man, it was one thing as a young shepherd to go, God, do what you like. It's another thing as an older king who's messed up to just, man, this is hard. This is costly, but God, I know this is how it works. I offer a sacrifice of everything back to you again. I'm back on the altar. Just one final thought. The real significance of this wasn't clear till later on. You know, that first incident, it's almost like David recovered the gifts and call on his life. But the real significance of the second one isn't found until 2 Chronicles 3, 1 and 2. It says this, then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of this guy, the Jebusite, the place provided by David. See, you're not just, the cost, the sacrifice is not just for you to reach your destiny. This issue, David, looking back, picked up. This was the place where Abraham had been called to sacrifice. He picked up legacy. He picked up promises. He picked up history. He picked up wells. But he did something more. And for your older, I really pray that you get this. And honestly, I pray that it melts your heart. You're not fighting for your destiny anymore. Your costly sacrifice is building the platform for the next generation. It was no longer about, but I've got this dream. It's the cost, the decision to pay the cost to get on the altar again, set up the next generation to build something that would last for generations. You know, I remember a time, maybe I can get the worship team on, remember a time when just saying to God, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I just felt God say two words to me. He just said this. It's fine. He just said this. It matters. It matters. It matters in ways that you will never maybe see this side of eternity. It matters for those looking on. It matters for the place that you're providing for others that will come after you. I don't know why, I don't know the details, but I know when you come and you rebuild the altar and you're like, man, God, this is hard, but I rebuild it and I climb on top of it, it matters. It matters. Can I invite you to stand? I just want to finish with the moment to respond. We say this is the altar. There's a picture in Israel of another part that they relaid the foundations of the temple, and they said it was messy because there were people crying, there were people laughing, and there were altars being built again. And I feel like there's just for a couple of moments, let's just have a bit of a messy rebuilding of the altars. There's some young people who are like me as a 15-year-old, whatever, say, God, I don't know where it's going, but I give it all to you. Even as we start, I just want you to move now if you feel like this is a moment for me to settle with this with God. I need to rebuild the altar. Just start to move and come, and you can kneel, you can stand, you can raise your hands, but it's like, God, I'm giving my whole life as a sacrifice to you. Giving my life as a sacrifice. Oh, good. Leon, God spoke to me that, this is a moment, this is a significant moment for you. Good man that you knelt first. This is a God thing for you. This is a divine setup. This is a moment that you'll remember like I do in decades to come when you did this thing. But I also want to talk to the people like me that have been around a while. And there's a costly altar to build. God, It hurts maybe, but I'm going to come. Just keep make room. Keep coming. But God, I choose. I'm just going to rebuild the altar. I'm going to climb back on. Because now it's not actually even about me. Oh, and this is a significant moment. Love if we maybe just started singing quietly as people respond. Just make room. If you can't get to the front, kneel where you are, stand where you are. Come on, this is an altar moment.